While it's hard for a single mother now, it is. It certainly is, right? But I guarantee you, it was way harder on the African savannah. Because back then, food resources were very scarce. And so it was very important, just kind of that traditional view that guys would go out and they'd hunt, and spear a zebra or something to bring home. And the women would typically gather berries, seeds, that kind of a thing. So it was a hunter-gatherer society, which for the major portion of our existence as humans, we've been hunters and gatherers. Okay, this kind of civilized, like let's read and let's, live in a civic society. That's a very recent thing for us as animals, okay? But we evolved to survive in these kinds of situations. So it was necessary that the husband and the wife, the man and the woman, stay together in order that they could help raise that child, okay? Because without that extra help, without the community, that child is less likely to survive. And in fact, even to this day, in most of the world that is not developed, there is a high infant mortality rate, okay? So that's why it's necessary that we have union. And it makes perfect sense. I often will say it's comparable to food, okay? Food also has three purposes, okay? And the first is obviously nourishment, okay? And I'm just kind of comparing this here. Union, well, we tend to eat together. There's a fancy word for that. There's a convivial nature. This comes from the Latin word convivium, which means feast, That eating together is like the ancient way of us coming together as a community or as a family. And then thirdly, it's enjoyment. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. When we look at these three components of sex and eating, we might notice something. Which one of these things, which number on the list is the most important? The first. Now, why is that? For survival. Yeah, that's exactly right. We'll just take food, for example, okay? If we all sat down to eat and we ate together, okay, and we were like, oh, it's so good to see you. Yeah, it's great. And we're eating this food and we're like, oh, this is so good. But for every bite we take, we chew it up and then we spit it in a bucket. Okay, that would be weird. Obviously, that's a weird thing, okay? But we could not live that way because you would die of starvation, right? Conversely, if food was only nourishing, all right? It's just like this oatmeal stuff, like they eat, in the Matrix, when they're in the ship and they've got to eat that, gooey stuff, and they're just like, and maybe, you just go to your room and you eat your porridge alone, right? That's no fun. That's no fun, but you're going to survive, okay? You're going to survive. So we understand that for food and for sex, that this number one thing has to be present, okay? It has to be present. In the same way, in a society where sex was unitive and enjoyable but not procreative, we'd all die off in 50 years or 100 years or whatever, okay? Now, if humans had sex to procreate and there was no union and there was no pleasure, it was just like animals, it wouldn't be great. There'd be a high infant mortality rate and it'd be a weird kind of cold, dark world, but we would go on, you see? So, when we're looking at sex, because I'll erase the food here, this is very interesting because, well, actually I could have left food because when you eat, okay, it's, say it gets to be dinner time, right? So you haven't eaten before this class. By the time you get out, you're going to want to eat, Why do you want to eat, It's 8:30 and you're, you haven't had dinner. Why do you want to eat? You want to eat because you're hungry, You just like, and it's going to taste good, all right? Nobody sits down and makes a meal like, this will nourish me, Nobody's thinking of that. They're not really thinking of that notion, okay? We're just kind of thinking like, I want to eat, right? That's it, okay? So it's kind of funny that when it comes to food and sex, we tend to feel compelled by number 3. That's kind of where our feelings lie, all right? Or when you go and you run a mile and you come back and you're like, oh man, I'm thirsty. You're not like, I must input this so I don't dehydrate. No, you're like, I'm thirsty. I need to satisfy my thirst, okay? So that's an important way to look at this, but we must understand that this is the real purpose for it, even though more often than not we're kind of driven by this. Okay. I have a thesis, okay? And if you were to say that, like, what was Father Clifton's, like, main overarching point today, okay? And this is my theory, all right? It's not really my theory, okay? But this is how I think it plays out, okay? That in life, all right, when we as individuals or as a society, okay, as a civilization, fulfill the precepts of natural law, things go well, all right? When we as individuals or families or as a society, a civilization, violate natural law, things go lousy, okay? The obvious example we talked about is if murder was allowed, right? That would not make the world better. That would make it a nightmare. It would be like, what's that movie where you get one day to kill everyone you want? But it,
Purge.
The Purge, okay? It'd be like the Purge every day, okay? That would not be an improvement, all right? I guarantee you they would not come out with like Windows 11 under that kind of society, okay? It's just not going to happen, all right? Now, everybody knows that about murder, but see, sex is kind of the big contentious issue, Sex is kind of the issue of, well, what does it all mean? What's it all about, That I would propose to you here today that when we as individuals or as a society violate the norms of natural law in human sexuality, that it begins to cause our civilization, specifically our families and our relationships, to break down. It causes it to break down, okay? And I'll give you a lot of examples for that, okay? And it's my thesis, I would say, is that what I'm going to start talking to you about in terms of studies and in terms of trends with marriage and divorce, it seems to fit pretty well with this notion that I'm telling you. So, for example, when a couple gets married, okay, a couple that has a child very early on in the married relationship, okay, so they have a child like within the first year, they have a much more likely chance of staying together than a couple who says, let's get married, but let's wait 5 years. Okay, they say, let's wait 5 years. Now, that couple who's going to wait 5 years, does that mean they're not going to have sex for 5 years? So that couple, is their sex unitive? Yeah, they're together. Is it enjoyable? Well, sure. Okay. But is it procreative? No. So there's where you start to run into, it can become what it would become for that couple during those 5 years. It would be the sexual equivalent of sitting down with a nice meal, talking about your day, chewing it up, and spitting it out. Okay? You would not be satisfying the purpose of food, and you would not be satisfying the purpose of sex. Now, that's kind of a weird concept. It's not something you get growing up. It's not something you get in public schools or even in Catholic schools a lot of the time. But it is an interesting idea, and it's based on this tradition of family and whatnot. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about what makes a relationship more likely to last and more likely to fail. Okay? And before I do that, I just want to ask, are there any questions about anything we've talked about so far in terms of the natural law, in terms of the purposes of food and sex? Okay. If you have any, just raise your hand. Let me know. Sex is obviously the necessary element of the family, okay? Because without it, you cannot create a family. Okay, you can certainly have a pair bond, okay, but in terms of raising children, you can't have that naturally. Now you can say, well, what about adoption? Well, sure, of course, but that child that you adopted, they came through sex, okay? They weren't like AI kid, robot kid, okay? They are real, actual people who came through sex, okay? Every single person you see walking on the face of the earth, they are the result of a sexual act, okay? It's an interesting, weird thing to think of, but it is the case, even if it was done through like artificial whatever, I mean, it was still using, the male and using the female, okay? So when we start to look at what makes a relationship more likely to succeed or fail, we're going to be talking about what is statistically more likely. Now a very important phrase, and I want you to remember this while we're talking about this, okay? I'm going to say it's statistically more likely or less likely, okay? That's very important, because if I look at you and I say, for example, that they did a study, and they didn't, I'm making this up, okay? And people in the morning who have eggs instead of oatmeal, okay? That we did this big study. We studied 1,000 people who eat eggs, and we studied 1,000 people who eat oatmeal, okay? And we found that people who eat eggs, on average, score 10% higher on their tests, in the morning, okay? I totally made it up, all right? Okay. Does that mean, if you read that study, and you say, oh, if I have eggs tomorrow morning, instead of getting an 80% on my test, I'm going to get a 90. Is that how that works? No. No. Remember, when you're dealing with statistics, you're always dealing with a large group of people. You're dealing with a huge group, all right? It's not saying this individual. Now, that's very important, because I'm going to start telling you things that increase or decrease your chances of divorce statistically. And I don't want you to go, oh man, I have this, I have that, and that's bad, so I'm doomed. I do not mean that, okay? Your chances of getting divorced or married, divorced or stay married, is exactly somewhere between 0 and 100%. Okay, that is your odds of getting divorced, all right? Somewhere in the range of 0 to 100%. But what I'm going to show you is that things that statistically kind of push it one way or the other, okay? So, for example, there are some things that we cannot control, okay? If you come from a family where your parents are divorced, you are more likely to divorce, okay? Again, now, statistically, you are more likely. That doesn't mean you yourself. That's very important to remember. But it's something to be aware of, okay? It's something to be aware of. If a person, for example, the more sexual partners that you have prior to marriage, the more likely you are to divorce, okay? So the more sexual partners you have before you get married, the more likely you are to divorce. There is a really funny thing, and I mentioned this in your last class, which I don't know why this is, but it's really funny. This study, it has this chart, and it says, like, what are your odds of getting divorced? Okay, and it's like 100% and 0%, okay? And if you've only had sex with your spouse, it's like way down here around 10%. Okay. Do you know what the divorce rate is in the country right now? No. Yeah, it's about half, okay? That kind of, to use the proper theological term, that really sucks, okay? Because what it means is that that's kind of a coin toss, that you could experience what after the death of a close family member is like the worst thing you can go through. And I don't say that to scare you so that you don't get married and just say, well, I won't deal with it at all. Because I will mention this. People who are married statistically are much happier than people who are not. Okay? People who are married are healthier, they're happier, they live longer, so marriage is actually, believe it or not, when they did these studies where they said what makes a person happy. What makes a person happy, and they looked at income, they looked at every different thing that you could find. The single component that was more likely than anything else to make someone happy is a marriage. Okay? So marriage is actually a very, very good thing. It's a very good thing. Okay, so don't let me scare you out of getting married. But I want to inform you so that you can, make sure if you choose to live in a certain way so that you are increasing your chances here. I don't know, it's just kind of a funny thing that the more sexual partners you have, the more likely you are to get divorced until you get over this, I can't remember what the number is. It's like this really high number. And for whatever reason, when they did this study, it goes down slightly.